now.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Nature in Your Classroom YouTube live stream. My name is Jasmine, and I'm going to be one of your hosts today. So you might notice that we're streaming live from a kind of different place than we normally do. You can see I am here in downtown Toronto. I'm actually here on my back porch. And the reason for that is because of the topic that we're going to be discussing today. So our topic for today's live stream is urban wildlife. We are going to be talking all about the wildlife that shares the city with us and how they survive here in the city and what they need to survive. So that's going to be the topic that we're covering today. We have a few helpers who are helping out with this live stream as well. We have some of our friends who are managing the chat today. And then we also have Linda, who's going to be supporting with questions. She's also going to be sharing some of her knowledge with us as well. Linda, you can come on and say hi.
Hi, everyone. It's a great pleasure meeting you all here. And thank you, Jasmine, for introducing me. Back to you, Jasmine.
Awesome. Thank you, Linda. So as you're watching today's live stream, if you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat. Or if your students have any questions and you're their teacher, you can go ahead and put those questions in the chat on behalf of them. We're going to be taking time at the end to answer all of your questions. We also have a worksheet that's associated with today's live stream that you can actually register for online. We'll pop up a photo of what that worksheet looks like. So we'll put a link in the chat. If you haven't registered for this worksheet yet, you can go ahead and register by clicking on the link that will show up in the chat. And then you'll be able to receive that worksheet and follow along by completing that worksheet with today's live stream. Okay. So to get into our topic of the day, I first want to introduce the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. So I myself am an educator with the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. And what that means is that I teach just like your teacher, but I don't teach in a classroom. I teach outside. So you can see I am in this wonderful outdoor space today. And I'm so lucky that it is not a very cold day today. It's quite warm. I love being outside and I love sharing nature with all of you. Here in the city, it can sometimes feel hard to find that nature. But what we're going to be talking about today is that nature is really all around us, even in really urban environments like I'm in right now. So most of us who are tuning in today probably live in the Greater Toronto area, and this is an urban area. So what does that word urban mean? I invite you to go ahead and write your thoughts in the chat if you have any ideas about what urban means. And it can mean a lot of different things. I'm going to go ahead and define what I think it means. And basically, when I hear urban, I think of an area where there are a lot of people living in that space. So a big density of humans, and that means that these humans have big buildings. So big human-made structures and a lot of people living in them. As humans, we kind of modify our surrounding environment to meet our needs. So our needs are food, so we build grocery stores. Our needs are shelter, so we build homes and other structures where we can live. We also have needs for entertainment and exercise and things like that. So we build all of these buildings that can meet our needs. But we're not the only animals that live in urban areas. Who do we share this space with? Well, it's the topic of today's live stream, and it is wildlife, right? So all of these other animals, plants, and living things also exist in this city, and they find ways to survive here in this city. I should mention that I am very much in an urban environment, and in any urban environment, we have a lot of noise. So as we're going through our live stream today, you might hear some cars, you might even hear sirens or the streetcar behind me, and that's just a part of the space that we've created as humans to live in. So when animals are living in the city, animals are looking for a place to live. They're looking for an area to live that fills all of their needs. What is the name of this place, this area where animals live? And I'll give you a hint. It starts with an H. I'll give you a second to see if you can guess it. Okay, if you said habitat, you are correct. So animals in an urban area, just like animals in other areas, need habitats to survive. And habitats are an area where an animal or plant can find everything that fills their needs. And animals' needs are pretty similar to ours. They need shelter, they need food, they need water, they need air to breathe in, just like us. Everybody go ahead and take in a deep breath of air. Oh, and let it out. I love breathing in the air outside, especially. I feel like it's so fresh. They also might need space and sunlight. So kind of the challenge for animals in an urban environment is trying to find these habitats and trying to find places in the city that can fulfill all of their needs. You might notice that there are a lot of animals that live in other parts of Ontario, maybe more rural parts of Ontario, that we don't see here in Toronto. So what is it about animals that live here in Toronto, and what makes them able to survive in the city? One of the things that helps animals survive in an area where we have a lot of humans is something called adaptations. So adaptations are behavioral, which means kind of the actions that animals make or the way they move through life, or physical, which has to do with an animal's body and the way their body is made up. And so behavioral or physical traits that help them to adapt or respond to a changing environment. So a lot of the animals that we're going to talk about today, a lot of the animals that you've probably seen in your neighborhood are animals that have adaptations that help them to survive well in a city like Toronto. And we would often call these animals tolerant animals. The reason why they're tolerant is because they can tolerate humans and the ways that we modify our environment. So all of the buildings that you can see behind me and all of this kind of urban settlement, some animals can tolerate that and other animals cannot. And those are more sensitive animals. This goes for plants too. So some plants like moss and lichen, for example, other organisms like lichen, some of them are more tolerant and can survive in an urban environment, and some of them are much more sensitive. And you'll only find those in more rural areas where there are less humans and less of the effects that humans can create on an environment. Okay, so I would love to share with you some of the animals that we can see here in the Greater Toronto area. We're going to talk about what their habitat needs are, and we're also going to talk about some of the different ways that they've adapted to living here. One of the first habitats that I want to share with you, and I'm going to bring up a different camera to do this. Here we go. All right. So one of the other habitats that we have in the city, and one of the kind of specific habitats that we have in the city, are what we see when we look up. So obviously one of the things that we see are buildings, but one of the living things that we can see when we look up at the sky are trees. And all of the trees that I can see when I'm standing on my back porch, these all are a part of something called the urban tree canopy. And the urban tree canopy is basically this collection of all of these branches and trunks and stems and leaves all across the urban area, so all across the Greater Toronto area. And combined, these create a really rich canopy that provides a lot of habitat needs to different types of animals. I encourage you to go ahead and look out your window right now, or maybe think about your neighborhood. Maybe think about your schoolyard or the streets that you walk on often, and think about some of the trees that you can see in your neighborhood. all of these trees, even though there's only a few in my backyard, all of these trees are really important for the animals that share the city with us, and for some animals in particular. The first animal that I want to talk about with you today, the first urban animal that I'm going to share with you, is one that you probably think of as soon as I mention the word urban wildlife. So this is probably one of the most common animals that we see in the city, and maybe one of the most loved animals that we have here in Toronto, and that is the raccoon. So raccoons are amazing. I love them. We certainly have a lot of them in the city, and it can sometimes be challenging to live around them. Raccoons really benefit off living around humans, and they sometimes can get into our way a little bit, right? It can be challenging to live alongside some of these animals. Raccoons really benefit from the urban tree canopy. And often in the winter, you may have noticed that there's not as many raccoons that are active during the winter, and that's because sometimes when raccoons will sleep for very long periods, up to a month in the winter if it's cold enough, and often they'll sleep up in trees or in buildings like this one, where they can stay warm and kind of wait out some of the colder months. Raccoons have some really interesting adaptations that help them to survive in urban areas. And to show that, I actually have an artifact from a raccoon right in front of me. So here I have a raccoon skull, and this is a replica of what a raccoon skull looks like. And what you can see is that raccoons have two different types of teeth. Well, they have many different types of teeth, but kind of two main different types. They have teeth that are sharp and teeth that are more flat. And so just like humans, if you feel around your mouth, you'll feel some teeth that are very sharp, and you'll feel some teeth that are very flat, like these back ones here. This means that raccoons are omnivores, so they eat all different types of things. And this is really beneficial for them when they're living around humans. I'll invite you all to hold out your hand right now and go ahead and wiggle your thumb. So you may know this, but raccoons actually have opposable thumbs. And this is what makes them so adept when they're searching for food in the city. And this is what makes them able to open up our garbage cans and take a look inside. I also have a raccoon fur here. The reason why I want to show you this is because raccoon fur actually gets thicker in the winter. And this is one of their adaptations as well that helps them survive here in North America and helps them keep them warm in the winter. Another urban animal that we have that benefits off this urban tree canopy, and you may be able to hear the siren in the background right now, are eastern gray squirrels. So eastern gray squirrels are another really common animal that you'll see running around the ground or climbing up into trees like this one here. And something that we can see during these months, in the winter months, are drays. So drays are essentially the nests that eastern gray squirrels create during the summer when they're breeding. So they create those nests for their babies to live in. But in the winter, eastern gray squirrels will often still use these nests to keep themselves warm. So I invite you all, next time you're outside, to have a look up into those trees that you have on your street and see if you can find some of those drays. There's a chance that there might be a squirrel in there as the weather starts to get colder. They might be hiding out in there and trying to stay warm. Okay. Another animal that I want to share with you that really benefits off of this urban tree canopy, and maybe one of the most diverse groups of animals that we have here in Toronto, are different species of birds. Here in my backyard, I see a lot of different species, especially in the wintertime. I see a lot of house sparrows, house finches, and dark-eyed juncos as well. So a few different types of species, usually just small songbirds. But here in the city, we have a large diversity of different species of birds. A few birds I wanted to mention to you are the red-winged blackbird. And the red-winged blackbird, normally we can see that in more rural areas. We can see red-winged blackbirds close to marshes and wetlands and things like that. But in the city, red-winged blackbirds have adapted to living in spaces that aren't as large. So often you can see them maybe by the roadside where there's kind of a wet area, or even on city streets in trees, they'll nest. So red-winged blackbirds have adapted to living in urban areas. Another animal that has adapted, another bird that has adapted to living in urban areas is the ring-billed gull. So there are actually a lot of different gull species, and the ring-billed gull is one that you can see a lot of the time in Toronto. Normally, you would see them along the shoreline, and we can still see some if you go down to Lake Ontario. That's where you can find a lot of different gull species. But across the city of Toronto, you can see them sometimes nesting in buildings, and ring-billed gulls have really adapted to be able to eat a wide variety of foods, and they often really benefit from the food that humans leave behind. I know that Linda has seen some really cool bird species in her urban area, and so I'd love for her to come on and share some of those with us now.
Thank you, Jasmine, and hello again, everyone. So I'm really lucky to have a really cool park right behind where I live. And what's unique about this park is that it has a wetland area. So here's a photo, basically what I see if I look behind my place. And you can see there's water, there are bushes and trees. And yesterday morning, I took this photo, and you can see many ducks that are still hanging around. And besides the ducks that stay around, I have some other cool birds, and I have a few videos to show you. So the first one is a bird called great blue heron. Sorry about that. So you may or may not notice this bird kind of looks like a crane, but it's not. So it's one of the common wetland birds that come around in the summertime, and their main diet is fish. So maintaining a healthy wetland habitat is really important for their survival. And they're one of those less tolerant species for urban development. So it's really important to maintain their wetland habitat for them. And the next video I will show you includes some of the common ones called Canada geese. I'm sure you all seen some of those around your neighborhood. And another one called double-crested cormorant. You may or may not notice in the video, the cormorants are stretching out their wings. And the reason for that is because the cormorants don't have as much oil on their wings compared to other birds like Canada geese or wood ducks. And the reason for that is so when they're diving, they can go really, really deep into the water, and without the oil, they have less resistance, so they're better hunters in the water. The consequence of that, obviously, is that their wings don't shed water like the other birds, so they have to stretch out their wings in the sun to dry them out a little bit. And back to you, Jasmine. Let's see where she will lead us to our next explorer.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Linda. So the next kind of habitat space that I want to talk about are human-made structures. You can see behind me, I have this kind of landscape of different buildings of different kind of make and size. And there are actually a lot of animals that can find habitats or find shelter in some of these buildings. First animal that I want to draw your attention to are bats. So here in the city of Toronto, we have a wide diversity of different species of bats. And I want to show you a photo of the little brown bat. So little brown bats are one of the species of bats that we can find here in the city of Toronto. And they've adapted really well to living in urban areas because they are able to find shelter in human-made structures. Sometimes it's true that we might not want a bat to be living in our attic, but in some of the less used human structures, like I have this shed behind me, in areas like that, bats are able to seek shelter and it doesn't affect humans. Bats are so amazing to have here in the city. They are excellent pollinators, so they really help out our native plants that we have growing here in Toronto. And they also eat a lot of different insects. So they keep the insect populations down to the level where they should be in urban areas. Another type of animal species that can live and find shelter in human-made structures are barn swallows. So barn swallows are a type of bird, and here we can see a barn swallow feeding their chicks in a nest, and that nest is actually built in on the side of a building. So barn swallows are another type of animal that will often use human-made structures in order to survive and to have that shelter so that they can then have the security to go out and find food and fill their other needs. While we're on the subject of birds and human-made structures, I want to mention that with all of the wildlife and all of the different species of animals that we're talking about, there are also a lot of risks associated with living in an urban environment. With birds specifically, collisions with buildings is a really big risk. During migratory periods, so in the spring and in the summer, we have a lot of birds that are moving through the city of Toronto, either going north or going south, depending on their destination and the time of year. Often with these really big buildings that we have here in Toronto, like this one over here, that often has glass on the side of it, birds can't tell the difference and they will collide with those buildings. There's a lot of different ways that we can kind of try to mitigate this effect. And one of the ways is being explored by an organization called FLAP, which is looking at how to make our buildings, like our buildings here in different cities, but especially here in Toronto, more safe for some of our migratory birds. Another aspect that can threaten some of the wildlife that live here in Toronto is the amount of noise and the noise pollution that we have here. So as you've noticed just during the past 20 minutes sitting out on my porch, there is a lot of noise and there are a lot of sounds that we create as humans with our machines and with our cars and with our daily lives. All of these sounds can really affect different types of animals, but especially birds, as birds rely on being able to communicate with one another through the sounds that they make, the bird sounds that they make in order to survive. With really high levels of noise, these birds might not be able to communicate with each other, which can pose a lot of problems. So it's just something to consider when we're thinking about an urban area and we're thinking about wildlife in an urban area. We should always be thinking about how we can make our urban area more welcoming to the wildlife who share it with us. We're going to be talking about that more a little bit later, but first, I want to take you on an adventure to a different space. So we're going to go to my other camera and we're going to venture downstairs. Awesome. Okay, here we go. So I am going to take you down these steps and I'm going to take you into my backyard space. So if we come down here, what I want to draw your attention to is kind of this general space, and a lot of kind of backyards or garden spaces in Toronto look like this. Luckily, in this area, I have a lot of really cool plants growing. And this plant, which we can see a lot of back here, is actually a native wildflower species. This is Canada goldenrod. And in the summer, Canada goldenrod has this beautiful yellow bloom. It is beloved by pollinators, like we can see in that picture, and also like pollinators that we can see right here. So bees and other insect species love Canada goldenrod, and they especially love our native plant species like this one. And even though this is a pretty small patch, if we look over at my neighbor's space, I know that my neighbor has some native wildflowers in her garden as well. So when you think of the city of Toronto, you can kind of think of it like this patchwork of small green spaces. So backyards or porches or other small areas like that, even maybe a small public park that you might have in your neighborhood, all of these kind of create this network of green patchworks. And that's really important for animals like some of our smaller pollinators here in the city who are able to move from space to space and collect all of the resources that they need, such as to find shelter or to find different sources of food, like the pollen they would collect from this goldenrod. Okay, we're gonna keep exploring this backyard space. We're gonna go down among all of these plants. And I wanna see if I can find some animal evidence back here. So I'm gonna take a look and I'm gonna look closer to the ground. So come on down with me. And as I look over here, oh my gosh, look what we have found. What do you think that is right there? I'll give you a hint. It came from an animal. This is animal scat or poop. And what animal do you think might have left that here in my backyard? I'll give you a few moments to guess. Okay, so if you said rabbit, you are correct. This came from the eastern cottontail rabbit, which is named because of that beautiful little fluffy cottontail that it has. And rabbits really rely on green spaces like this and the patchwork of green spaces like this to survive in an urban area like Toronto. They'll often hop from kind of covered area to covered area, and a lot of people can find them sometimes in their backyards, which is where sometimes they might build their nest. If we keep exploring down here, let's see what else we can find. I know that around this type of year, leaving your leaf litter in your backyard is really important for different types of insects that might spend the winter and hibernate over winter underneath these leaves. And if we take a closer look over here, here we go. You can see this is just a model, but this is a cocoon of a specific type of moth. And this cocoon is actually wrapped up in a kind of, this moth creates a cocoon that has this shell of leaves. And often this will be nestled under other leaves. This cocoon, this caterpillar will stay in its cocoon all winter long. And then in the spring, it will emerge. And that cocoon actually becomes this Luna moth. So Luna moths are a type of moth that we can see sometimes in the city of Toronto, and they're also really important pollinators for some of our native plant species. Okay, we're gonna go back upstairs now. So we've talked about different types of habitats here in the city of Toronto. We've talked about human structures, we've talked about the urban tree canopy, and we've talked about the patchwork of green spaces that can be created by small gardens or small potted plants and things like that on balconies. I want to talk now about some of the larger green spaces that we can find in the city of Toronto. So you might have one in your neighborhood, or you might live close to one. I live really close to High Park, which is a wonderful green space here in Toronto. We also have a wonderful network of ravines that cut through the Greater Toronto area. We're going to show a picture of the Humber River, which is a part of Toronto's ravine system. And in these ravines, we can often find some of the larger animals that might not be able to survive in some of the smaller kind of natural spaces that I've mentioned so far today. One of those animals is the eastern coyote. And the eastern coyote has a number of really cool adaptations that helps it to survive in an urban area like Toronto. So I'm going to bring you around now, and I'm going to show you an animal artifact I have from a coyote. So this is a replica skull of a coyote. And if we see here, we can see that just like the raccoon, coyotes have different sets of teeth. So they have some very, very sharp teeth at the front. And then at the back, they have some flatter teeth that we can see here. And this means that coyotes are able to eat a diverse range of different types of foods. So they often prefer to eat mammals and other animals. So things like the eastern cottontail rabbit that we were talking about earlier. but sometimes they will eat berries and plant materials and really whatever they can find. So that helps them to survive in a more urban area. Coyotes also have fur that looks like this. And this fur has a few benefits for coyotes. One thing is that it's really thick, which helps them to stay nice and warm during the winter. But if you have a look at that coloration, you can see that coyote fur has this really nice kind of gray and light brown that really matches up with natural spaces, especially during this type of year when everything is kind of this gray or brown. So having fur this color helps coyotes blend into their habitat and hide from humans. Coyotes aren't very scared of humans, but they're really good at staying hidden even when humans are really close by. So often you won't even see a coyote even though it might be really close to you, which is an amazing adaptation for these animals. Another animal that we can see in our ravine systems, but that we might not see walking downtown in an area like Yonge and Dundas, are white-tailed deer. And so white-tailed deer are another animal that certainly do live in Toronto and live more specifically in some of our larger natural spaces like some of our ravine systems. Okay, I'm going to move back to my laptop now. Here we go. And so we've talked so much about different habitats and the different animals that live here in Toronto and share this city with us. And what you might be wondering right now is, this is great. I'm so excited about the diversity of animals that share the city with us. You might have seen a lot of these animals in your lifetime living here in Toronto. But what I wanted us to think about now is, how can we make our city more welcoming to the wildlife that share this space with us? And one way that we can do that is through this idea of environmental stewardship. So you may have heard of this term before. And environmental stewardship means a lot of different things to different people. What it means to me is this personal responsibility to take care of the environment and take care of natural spaces that don't belong to me. So it's kind of this responsibility that we all share to make sure that the natural spaces maybe in our neighborhood, in our city, in our province are healthy and provide to wildlife and to plants what they need to survive. There are a lot of different ways to perform environmental stewardship in our daily lives. And I'm going to pass it over to Linda, who's going to share some of the ways that she performs environmental stewardship in her life.
Hi, thank you, Jasmine. And one of the ways I perform environmental stewardship is by carrying around a little gardening glove, something like this. And you can just fold it up, put it in your pocket, and once you're going on a walk or biking around in your park and you see some garbage laying around the ground, you can put on your glove and then pick them up and put it in the garbage can. So that way we can maintain a healthy and clean habitat space for the wildlife in our urban cities. And another way for us to perform environmental stewardship is to plant native flowers. So some of the native flowers, like Jasmine mentioned before, Canada goldenrod, or you can plant some flowers called Black-eyed Susan, which kind of looks like a mini sunflower. They're yellow petals with a black center. Another flower that's really pretty and also a native wildflower here is called wild bergamot. And these native flowers are really loved by all the pollinators that we have here in the cities. So plant some flowers and make sure to go pick up some garbage or be mindful where you put your garbage are great ways to perform environmental stewardships. I'm going to turn back to Jasmine and see if she has anything more to add before we move on.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Linda. Those sound like amazing ways to perform environmental stewardship. They sound like really easy ways to perform it in your daily life. There's a lot of different things that I try to do, and a lot of them aren't even large actions. I just do little things, like I try to recycle more. I try to ride my bike more when I'm moving around in the city instead of driving in a car. I also try to buy reused clothing and reuse a lot of my materials. So trying to limit how much waste I'm creating and how much pollution I'm creating while I'm moving around the space. All right, we're at 2:35 now, so if you do have to go, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We are going to move on to questions now. If you have a question for myself or Linda, feel free to go ahead and write it in the chat and we'll be able to answer it. And I'm going to invite Linda back on to see if we've had any questions throughout our live stream today.
Jasmine, I have a question for you. So when I see animals in the city, sometimes they kind of look injured. Do you have any good ideas in terms of how we approach injured animals in the city?
That's a great question. Yeah. So, one part of environmental stewardship is definitely looking out for the animals that share the city with us and helping them when they need help. There's a great center in Toronto, the Toronto Wildlife Center, which should be your first point of contact if you see an injured animal in the city of Toronto. But I do want to mention one thing, which is that in the spring, often we can see baby birds that may have fallen out of their nest, and this can be a really natural part of their life cycle. Often they have to fall out of their nest while they're learning to fly, and so while they may look like they're in distress to us, they might not actually be in distress. So in those situations, I would encourage you always to do research if you see an injured animal and make sure that this animal actually needs your help before intervening. But the Toronto Wildlife Center, maybe we can put a link to that in the chat. Toronto Wildlife Center is a great resource for helping out injured animals here in Toronto. Do we have any other questions, Linda?
I believe there is one. So Paul asked, do you live in the city?
Oh, great question. Yes, I do live in the city of Toronto, and I live in the kind of downtown core. So I'm very downtown right now, and you can probably tell by the amount of noise you can hear behind me. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it on camera, but my bird feeder over here is getting some action. So maybe I'll go ahead and turn my camera, and that way if you can see some birds coming in, you might get the chance to see them. But yes, I do live in the city. Thanks for asking.
And we have another question by Shira. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Shira asked, is animal poop good for the soil? And the second question is, how long does it take for the moth to get out of the cocoon?
Oh, good questions. So I think that animal scat is absolutely good for the soil. It all has to do with this kind of cycle of materials and energy and resources kind of going into an animal. So that plant material going into the animal, or that animal material going into that animal, and then coming back out and eventually going back into the ground. So when we think about this cycle, animal poop absolutely helps to fertilize the soil to then grow more plants to feed more animals. So it's this wonderful kind of self-sustaining cycle that's being created. For moths, I think it really varies on the type of moth. I know that some moths do a lot of their reproduction and laying eggs and building cocoons in the summer, and others do it kind of later in the fall. For the Luna moth, I'm not exactly sure how many months it takes for it to get out of its cocoon, but I think it has to do more so with the temperature. So they'll go into their cocoon and they'll stay there until the days start to get longer and until temperatures start to rise. And then they know that it's safe for them to emerge and that they won't be too cold once they do emerge. And that's my best answer to that question. Thank you so much for asking.
So we have another question, also from Shira. I think there are two more questions from Shira. First one is, what are your favorite animals to help? And the second one is, do wolves hunt in packs in urban neighborhoods?
Okay, good questions. So what is my favorite animal to help? I would say I really don't have a favorite animal to help. And in fact, I prefer not to help animals. I prefer to keep my distance from wild animals and hope that they are staying healthy and that they never need my help in order to survive. And this goes kind of for best guidelines when you are interacting with wild animals in the city of Toronto. It's really to keep your distance. Unless that animal is severely injured, it's living its own life and it probably doesn't want anything to do with you. So really what we should do when we're interacting with animals in the wild and even in urban areas is to just keep our distance, mind our business, and let that animal continue on with its day. And the second question about wolves. I'm glad you mentioned wolves. When we were talking about the coyote earlier, coyotes are a more tolerant animal, which means that they're able to live in urban environments like the city of Toronto. Wolves are a much more sensitive animal. They're not as tolerant. So you won't see wolves living in more urban areas. We do have wolves in Ontario, but these wolves live farther north in much more rural areas where they have a lot more space and aren't as close to humans. So there aren't any wolves living in Toronto. As for coyotes, coyotes don't really hunt in packs. They often are solitary animals unless they're with their family or with their babies that they're raising. And coyotes will usually keep their distance from humans. They're not interested in you and they're not looking to eat you up. They have their own food sources and they really just want to go on with their own thing. So yeah, good questions. Thank you.
We have a question from Paul. How do you take care of injured insects?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Linda, do you have any thoughts on that?
I do, because recently I watched a video where someone helped an injured monarch butterfly to kind of modify its wings, because the butterfly lost part of its wings, so it cannot fly. And then they did a mini surgery where they taped on a section of the wings. And surprisingly, it worked. The butterfly was able to fly. But on second thought, though, if you're not sure how to help out an injured insect, maybe the best way is to move it to a safer space. Let's say move it off the side road, and hopefully it will heal on its own. And if you're not sure what you're doing, the best you can do is to not do any more damage.
Definitely. Yeah, I would 100% agree with that. In most cases with insects, they have their own kind of systems to fight off injuries and things like that. So usually there's not a lot we can do for injured insects. But I'm really happy that you're thinking about wildlife big and really, really small. I think that's important. Often we focus on some of the larger mammals we can see in Toronto, and we don't think so much about some of those smaller animals. So thanks for mentioning that.
So we have a question from Amy. Are there fish in the wetland habitat? I think I will jump in here first, and then Jasmine, you can add on anything you can think of later. So the habitat I have behind where I live, the little wetland park, there are absolutely fishes in there. I've seen the great blue heron and the cormorant fishing in the wetland in the little pond there. So I can say for sure they do have fish in there. And in some of the other parks, like for example, downtown at a place called Leslie Spit, there's a Tommy Thompson Park, and there are definitely fishes in those wetlands as well. And Jasmine, do you have anything to add?
No, that was great. Yeah, I think what you said about, the great blue heron wouldn't probably be in that space if there wasn't a food source there, right? So making that connection between these animals that eat other animals and then having those those fish in that space. Makes a lot of sense to me.
Our next question, let's see. We get lots of questions today. Thank you all for asking all these wonderful questions. So this question is from Crystal. How do animals like rabbits get in our backyard?
That's a really interesting question. So I guess when we're thinking about rabbits and where they come from, rabbits are pretty well ingrained into our city right now. So a lot of animals, or a lot of rabbits, their actual shelter and their actual habitat could be someone's backyard. They've been here for a really long time. So even before the city of Toronto was created, there were probably eastern cottontail rabbits living here. And now that this city has built up around them, they're still living here and they're still looking for ways to survive. If they're in your backyard and they haven't been there recently, maybe that's a case of them hopping from patchwork to patchwork. So moving from small green space to small green space within the city. I know that some of our larger natural areas like our ravines and Hyde Park can support a higher number of some of our animals like our rabbits. So maybe they were in a space like that and then they moved out into your neighborhood just to see what was there, and then maybe they're heading back.
Awesome. Thanks, Jasmine. Our next question is from Crystal. Do animals have trouble surviving in Toronto?
That's a really good question. Yeah, so as I mentioned with some of the bird species, there are some ways that Toronto can be threatening to some of our animals that live here with us. So definitely those higher noise levels that we can see or hear, I guess, especially today, that can impact animals and their ability to communicate with one another. The built structures that we have in our urban spaces also can provide the risk of collisions with birds. There's some other risks as well. Definitely the traffic that we have in the city, all of the cars and bikes and people moving around, that can affect animals as well. You know, if they're trying to cross the road, that might not end so well. Linda, do you have any other ideas of how cities can be dangerous for animals?
I think it's mostly to do with our behaviors. I think runoff can be dangerous for some of the birds and also the invertebrates, especially the runoff leaching into the soil and that get into the system of the invertebrate. And the invertebrate are an important food source for all of the birds here in Toronto. So sometimes that can also lead, like have a snowball effect on down the food chain.
Definitely, yeah. So the pollution that we cause by living here can absolutely affect animals. So there are some things that pose a threat to animals living in here in Toronto, and there are some ways that animals do have trouble surviving here. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of the animals that we see have those adaptations. They're more tolerant, and that's why we don't see a massive diversity of different types of animals living here in Toronto, because some of those animals and some of those plant species, like I was mentioning before, need a more rural place in order to survive. And they can't tolerate living this close to humans and our settlements.
Our next question is from Marvin Heights. So, why do some animals look scary but aren't actually dangerous?
Good question. Hey, Marvin Heights, thanks so much for tuning in. So that's that's a good question. Animals all come in different shapes and different sizes. Sometimes animals can look scary for specific reasons. And one of those reasons could be to ward off predators. So I know with some of our insect species, they can be really brightly colored. And even though that doesn't look scary to us, that's sending signals to the predators that might eat them that they are toxic and they are not yummy and please don't eat me. So that's one of the ways that animals kind of signal to other animals that they are not good for eating. Animals like our coyotes are not very dangerous, but they might look scary to you, maybe because they have those really long teeth. And it's just important to remember that those teeth are not likely to be used on us, and they're just a part of what that animal needs to survive when it's eating meat. So a lot of animals might have those adaptations that might look scary to humans, but really they're just tools that that animal has that helps it to survive. I don't know, Linda, if you had anything to add to that.
I think you covered it brilliantly, Jasmine. So thank you for that answer. Our next question is from Amy. Are there any animals that are found in the GTA that are not in downtown Toronto?
That's a great question. Yeah. And it kind of goes into when we're thinking about an urban area, you know, an urban area isn't just the high rises that we can see in the downtown core, right? It's also areas like where I am right now. I am surrounded by birds at the moment. And as we move further into the GTA, we see less of these kind of dense areas of high rises and condos and buildings, and more areas where there is green space, where we have trees and we have more kind of natural areas that humans haven't paved over or built over yet. So there are definitely animals that can survive in those more natural areas that couldn't survive in the downtown area. Even animals like the deer that I was mentioning earlier, we're much more likely to see deer out in the GTA than we are to see them in the downtown area. And that's just because they're big animals and they need that space that they can't find here downtown. Linda, can you think of any other animals that we might be able to see in the GTA, but not so much downtown?
Besides the larger animals, usually like the bears and the deers, what I can think of there are some special birds, especially the songbirds that live in the forest area or live in the mountain area. Usually you find them more higher up north instead of down south in the downtown area where there are many buildings instead of trees. I couldn't recall the specific species at the moment though, but definitely some of the forest songbirds.
Definitely. That's a great point. Yeah, it's pretty rare to see more unique species of songbirds here in the downtown core. We have Tommy Thompson Park, which is an amazing space to see a diversity of different birds. But definitely throughout the rest of downtown Toronto, it's harder to see some of those birds. As we move further into the GTA, where there are more trees and more natural areas, we have a higher chance of being able to see some of those. It's a really good question. Thanks for asking. I encourage you to research on your own too and to look into it.
All right. I think we have two more questions. First one is from Stevie. How do animals survive on their own? And the next one, I think it's from Marvin Heights. How many animals have went extinct because of the environment in Canada this year? Ooh.
Okay. So for that first question, animals survive on their own through a number of different ways. And one of the ways is that animals grow and develop really, really quickly, usually much quicker than humans do. So as babies, when humans are born, we're really reliant on our parents, and we can't fend for ourselves for a number of years, right? As opposed to other animals, and there's a lot of animal species that within the first year that they're born, they've left their parents and they're able to kind of live a life by themselves. And a lot of that is what they've inherited from their parents. So these kind of natural abilities to know how to look for food and to know how to survive. Sometimes that's taught from their parents to them as well, usually in a shorter period. But for example, with the birds that I was mentioning earlier, their parents will teach them how to fly, and they'll kind of share some of those skills that they might not have learned inherently. They might not have kind of inherently. So usually, sometimes they have it by themselves or they learn a little bit from their parents. But animals are much more adept at surviving on their own than we are, I would say, for the most part. Non-human animals, I should say. And for the second question, I think that's a really big question, and I honestly don't have an answer for you. I know that more and more as we consider climate change and global warming, extinction levels are rising. And so there's certainly animals, especially some of the smaller animals like insects and invertebrates, like Linda was talking about earlier, that are going extinct. I don't have any numbers for you, but again, I would encourage you to research that and learn more about that on your own time. Oh, and it looks like we might have answered that question in the chat, which is awesome. Do we have any more questions, or is that all the questions we have for today?
I think that's all the questions we have for today. So if there isn't any more questions, we'll be wrapping up. Thank you all again for tuning in. It was our pleasure to have you all here, and hopefully you learned something.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in this afternoon. I encourage you to get outside, keep exploring, and looking for urban wildlife in your neighborhoods. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.